The pistols had silencers. That detail matters. It tells you everything about what kind of killing this was and everything about what kind of world Angelo Sepe had been living inside for the last 20 years. Because in this world, the loudest men always died in the quietest rooms. And this room, a basement apartment at 8869 20th Avenue in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, was as quiet as a room could get, below street level, no windows facing the avenue. The kind of place a man moves into when he wants to disappear. On the morning of July 18th, 1984, someone walked down those basement stairs carrying 2 pistols fitted with suppressors. They found Angelo John Sepe inside. They put 3 bullets into his head. No struggle, no warning shots, no negotiation. 3 rounds and silence. The bodies were discovered at 8:10 in the morning. Angelo was 42 years old. He had survived the most dangerous robbery crew in American criminal history. He had outlived men who were tougher, smarter, and better connected than he ever was. And in the end, he died in a room so small and so dark that you could walk past it on 20th Avenue and never know it existed. Most people who tell this story start with the Lufthansa heist, the $5.8 million, the biggest cash robbery in American history at the time. They start there because that is the famous part, the cinematic part, the part Robert De Niro made immortal. That version of the story ends with the money vanishing and the crew getting picked off one by one. The version the public remembers is a heist gone wrong. But the real architecture of Angelo Sepe's death runs deeper than a botched robbery and a paranoid boss-cleaning house. It runs through a system of control that was being built inside the Lucchese crime family during the exact years Sepe was trying to survive. A system where Anthony Casso, the most paranoid man in American organized crime, was turning police detectives into intelligence assets and transforming addresses into death warrants. And once that machine was operational, a man hiding in a Bensonhurst basement had about as much chance of surviving as a man standing in the middle of Times Square with a target sewn to his back. This is the story of how a small-time operator with a long criminal record and a short fuse made himself visible in a world that punished visibility with death. Angelo Sepe grew up in South Ozone Park, Queens, in the shadow of 2 things that would define his entire life. The first was JFK Airport, which sat just south of the neighborhood like a vault waiting to be cracked. Cargo moved through that airport constantly. Furs, electronics, jewelry, currency. For the crews operating out of Queens in the 1960s and 70s, JFK was not an airport. It was a supply chain. The second thing that shaped Sepe was Robert's Lounge, a nondescript bar at 1445 Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park that functioned as the unofficial headquarters of James Burke's crew. Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent, ran one of the most profitable criminal operations under the Lucchese family umbrella, hijacking, loan sharking, bookmaking, and eventually something much bigger. Sepe was drawn into that orbit early. He was lean, barely over 5 feet tall, unkempt, and angry in a way that made him useful to men who needed things done without questions. His criminal record started at 14 years old. By the time he was in his 20s, he had 14 arrests, ranging from petty larceny to burglary. None of them stuck. Witnesses had a way of losing their memory when Angelo Sepe was involved. That was his value, not his intelligence, not his earning power, his willingness to do what most men hesitated to do. When Jimmy Burke needed a body to help move product, Angelo showed up. When Burke needed someone to put fear into a debtor, Angelo showed up. When Burke needed something worse than fear, Angelo was already in the car with the engine running. By the mid-1970s, Sepe had become one of Burke's most relied-upon enforcers. He was close with Tommy DeSimone, another volatile young killer in the crew who would later be immortalized as Tommy DeVito in the film Goodfellas. Together they formed the sharp end of Burke's operation. The blunt instruments. The men who did not attend sit-downs or negotiate percentages, but who ensured that the men who did attend those meetings had leverage. In a crew full of dangerous people, Sepe stood out for one specific quality. He did not hesitate. Ever. That quality was a currency you could not deposit in any bank. But inside Robert's Lounge, it bought you a seat at the bar and a place on the crew when the biggest job in American criminal history came together. That job came on December 11th, 1978. Burke had been planning the Lufthansa heist at JFK for months, working intelligence from a cargo agent named Louis Werner, who had gambling debts he could not cover. The target was the Lufthansa Airlines cargo terminal. The take was supposed to be around $2 million. It turned out to be nearly 3 times that. Burke selected his crew carefully. Angelo Sepe was one of 6 men chosen to enter the terminal. The crew included DeSimone, Louis Scafora, Joe Manry, Paolo Lecastri, and Robert McMahon. On that December night, they moved through the cargo building systematically. They bound 11 employees at gunpoint. They cracked the vault. They loaded the cash and jewelry into a black Ford Econoline van. When they drove away from JFK into the dark streets of Queens, they had $5.8 million in United States currency and $875,000 in jewelry. It was the single largest cash robbery on American soil at that time. And it was the last good night most of those men would ever have. The next 7 days revealed everything about the system Angelo Sepe had chosen to serve. Because Jimmy Burke understood a principle that Sepe himself never fully grasped. The money was worthless if anyone talked, and the only way to guarantee silence was to eliminate anyone who might eventually break it. Parnell Stephen Edwards, known as Stax, was the first. His job had been simple: drive the van to a junkyard and have it crushed. Instead, Edwards went home, got high, fell asleep, and left the van parked near the airport where police found it within hours. 7 days after the heist, on December 18th, 1978, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe walked into Edwards' apartment in Flatbush. They shot him 6 times. That was Angelo's function in the aftermath. He was a silencer, not the kind you screw onto the barrel of a pistol, the kind that walks into a room and makes sure the person inside never speaks again. Over the next 5 years, the crew that pulled the Lufthansa job was systematically dismantled. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had connected Burke to the inside man, disappeared in January 1979. His body was never recovered. Louis Scafora and his wife Joanna vanished the same month. DeSimone was killed on January 14th, 1979, by the Gambinos for a separate debt of blood related to the murder of Billy Batts. Teresa Ferrara was murdered. McMahon vanished. Richard Eaton and Tom Monteleone, accused of skimming laundered heist cash, were both killed. One by one, the people connected to that $5.8 million were being erased. The money itself was never recovered. Not $1. The silence Burke demanded was enforced with bullets and shallow graves and car trunks and freezers in the back of Robert's Lounge. Angelo Sepe watched all of this happen. He participated in parts of it. He saw friends and conspirators vanish and understood that each disappearance was a message written in absence. And somehow for 6 years, he survived. That survival should have been his education. It should have taught him the only lesson that mattered in the Lucchese family's world. Stay within your boundaries. Do what you are told. Touch only what belongs to you. Do not draw attention. Do not freelance. Do not make people above you wonder what you are doing with your time. Angelo Sepe did not learn that lesson. He could not. Because the quality that made him valuable, his willingness to act without hesitation, was the same quality that made him incapable of restraint. While Sepe was navigating the wreckage of the Lufthansa crew in Queens, another man was building something far more sophisticated on the other side of Brooklyn. Anthony Salvatore Casso was born on May 21, 1942, in South Brooklyn, on Union Street near the waterfront. Just a few miles from Sepe's world in Queens, but an entirely different universe. Where Sepe was impulsive, Casso was calculating. Where Sepe was a blunt instrument, Casso was an architect of systems. As a teenager growing up near the docks, where his father worked as a longshoreman, Casso had joined the South Brooklyn Boys street gang. His talent for violence and his skill as a marksman, reportedly shooting birds off tenement rooftops with a homemade silenced .22 caliber rifle, as a boy, caught the attention of Christopher Furnari. Furnari was a Lucchese captain who ran what was known as the 19th Hole Crew out of a bar at 1402 86th Street in Bensonhurst. He saw something in young Casso that went beyond muscle. Casso could plan. He could anticipate. And he had a quality that would define his entire criminal career, a quality that would eventually consume everything around him. He trusted no one. Not completely. Not ever. By the late 1970s, Casso and his closest ally, Vittorio Amuso, had become Furnari's most valuable assets. Together they ran the Bypass Gang, a professional burglary ring targeting banks, vaults, and jewelry stores across Manhattan and Long Island. By conservative estimates, the gang stole more than $100 million in merchandise over the course of a decade. But Casso's ambitions extended beyond safecracking. He understood that real power in the Lucchese family did not come from stealing. It came from knowing who was talking to the FBI, knowing who was earning off the books, knowing who was stepping outside their lane, and knowing before anyone else in the organization did. Information was the product Casso valued most, and he would eventually find a way to buy it from the most protected source in New York City. That obsession with intelligence led Casso to cultivate relationships that would have been unthinkable to a street-level operator like Angelo Sepe. By the mid-1980s, Casso had placed 2 active New York City Police Department detectives on his payroll. Stephen Caracappa was a member of the NYPD's Organized Crime Homicide Unit, which gave him direct access to files on mob informants, active investigations, and surveillance operations. Louis Ippolito was a decorated officer whose own father had been a member of the Gambino crime family. Through a Lucchese associate named Burton Kaplan, who acted as middleman, Casso paid the 2 detectives $4,000 a month. In return, they provided something no amount of muscle could buy. They gave him real-time access to law enforcement intelligence, informant identities, surveillance schedules, home addresses, phone records. The names and locations of anyone who was cooperating or thinking about cooperating with federal authorities. Consider what that means. A criminal organization operating with the investigative resources of the New York City Police Department at its disposal. A rising Lucchese leader who could request a target's current address, their known associates, their legal status, and receive that information within days. The streets of Brooklyn and Queens, for men like Casso, had become transparent. And for men like Sepe, who moved through those same streets believing they were invisible, the world had changed in ways they would never understand until it was too late. Caracappa and Ippolito did not just provide intelligence, they acted on it. In September of 1986, they kidnapped Gambino associate James Hydell on a Brooklyn street, forced him into the trunk of their car, and delivered him directly to Casso for interrogation. Casso tortured Hydell until he gave up the names of everyone involved in an earlier attempt on Casso's life. Then Casso killed him. On Christmas Day of 1986, intelligence the detectives provided led to the murder of a man named Nicholas Guido, the wrong Nicholas Guido. An innocent man with no mob connections, shot dead on a holiday because the address in the police database matched the wrong name. On November 6, 1990, the 2 detectives pulled over Gambino Captain Edward Lino on the Belt Parkway in Brooklyn. Caracappa walked to the driver's side window and shot Lino 9 times at point-blank range. For that piece of work, Casso paid $65,000, delivered in a cardboard box containing $70,000 in hundreds. Between 1986 and 1992, the 2 detectives were connected to 8 murders, 3 attempted murders, and a web of obstruction that stretched across every borough. In total, Casso paid them $375,000. They were not caught until March of 2005, convicted in 2006. Sentenced to life in 2009. That was the ecosystem Angelo Sepe was living inside without understanding a fraction of it. The Lucchese family, by the early to mid-1980s, was not simply a collection of crews running traditional rackets in their respective territories. It was an organization where information flowed upward with terrifying efficiency, where a street-level associate's unsanctioned activities could be identified through law enforcement channels and acted upon before the associate knew he was being watched, where an address scribbled in a police file could become coordinates for a killing. Sepe had no seat at any table where these decisions were made. He had no idea what Casso was building 3 miles away in Bensonhurst. He only knew the old rules: earn, kick up your percentage, stay useful. And when the old rules did not provide enough to live on, take what you could and hope nobody noticed. After the Lufthansa aftermath settled, Sepe found himself in a diminished position that would have frightened a more perceptive man. Jimmy Burke was arrested and would eventually be convicted of murder in 1985. He would die in prison on April 13, 1996, never having revealed where the Lufthansa money went. The Roberts Lounge crew was functionally extinct. The men Sepe had worked with were dead, missing, or cooperating with federal prosecutors. Henry Hill had entered witness protection in 1980 and was providing testimony that would put Burke away. The entire network Sepe had operated within for 15 years had collapsed around him. He served 10 months on a parole violation. He was arrested again in early 1984 on a weapons charge and was awaiting trial. He had no patron, no protector, no steady income within the sanctioned structure of the family. He was a man with a violent reputation and no authorized outlet for it. A loaded weapon with nobody holding the handle. Accounts vary on what happened next. One version, documented in the book The Heist, states that approximately 1 week before his death, Sepe robbed a drug dealer who was connected to an established crime family. Some accounts say the dealer paid protection to a Colombo family captain. Others place the dealer under Lucchese protection. The specific identity of the dealer and the exact nature of the protection arrangement remain disputed across multiple sources. What is not disputed is the pattern. A man without authorization, operating outside the boundaries that kept the organization stable, touching money and product that did not belong to him, making himself loud in a world that had already decided it preferred silence. In the Lucchese family of the summer of 1984, that kind of freelancing did not generate a warning. It did not produce a conversation or a sit-down or an opportunity to make things right. It generated 2 men with suppressed pistols walking down basement stairs on a July morning. The killing at 8869 20th Avenue was professional in every respect. The entry was clean. The shots were precise. 3 rounds to the head. Sepe died in the position he was found in, which means he never made it to his feet. The hit was attributed in most accounts to a Lucchese squad, though some sources point to Gambino involvement as retribution for a separate grievance. No one was ever charged. No one was ever arrested. The investigation produced no suspects and no witnesses willing to speak. The killing was clean in the way that only organized crime killings can be clean. Not because evidence was destroyed, but because nobody with authority had any interest in seeing it solved. Angelo Sepe had become a problem, and problems in this world had a single solution. He had survived the Lufthansa heist. He had survived the purge that followed. He had survived the disappearances, the shallow graves, the frozen bodies, the entire wave of Burke's paranoid house-cleaning that eliminated nearly every member of the original crew. He survived all of it because he was useful. And he died the moment he stopped being useful and started being a liability. 14 years after Sepe's murder, Anthony Casso was sentenced to 455 years in federal prison. He had confessed involvement in at least 36 killings. He had admitted to ordering dozens more. He had exposed the Mafia cops, burned every alliance he had ever built, and been expelled from the witness protection program for bribery, assaults, and compulsive lying. The information network he had constructed, the apparatus that turned police databases into a targeting system for organized crime, was dismantled piece by piece in a federal courtroom. But the principle behind it survived long after the courtroom went dark. In the world Casso built, information was never just a tool. It was the only tool that mattered. And the men who controlled the most information were never the ones found in basement apartments with bullets in their skulls. They were the ones who sent the men carrying the silencers down the stairs. Casso died on December 15, 2020, at the United States Penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona. COVID-19 took him. He was 78 years old, wheelchair-bound, lungs failing. A federal judge had denied his request for compassionate release just 17 days before he stopped breathing. He went out without a sound, which was the one thing he had spent his entire career making sure everyone else did too. Angelo Sepe's killing on that July morning in Bensonhurst was efficient, professional, and almost immediately forgotten. One more body in a decade that produced hundreds of them across the 5 boroughs. The newspapers ran a brief story. The police filed their report. The case went cold before the summer ended. But there is one detail about the morning of July 18th that most accounts mention only in passing, as if it were a footnote rather than the truest thing about this entire story. When the 2 men finished with Sepe, they did not leave. They walked through the small basement apartment to a tiny sleeping alcove in the back. 19-year-old Joanne Lombardo was asleep inside. One of the gunmen placed his suppressed pistol against her mouth and pulled the trigger. She died without waking up, without knowing, without a sound. The silence in that basement apartment after everything was finished was the most complete silence a room in Brooklyn has ever held. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe to Mafia Talks. We release new episodes every week. Leave a comment with who you want us to cover next. This is Mafia Talks. Untold stories from the world of organized crime.